There's Mike. I think
Mute. Hello, how are you?
I'm good. One minor thing, we're already on with our audience. But if you would click the 3 buttons at the top, you can change it to your name because it says that you're me right now. Just FYI, because I think Megan had my login.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can do that. I'm operating from a phone, so I apologize.
Okay, well, if you can't do it, that's fine. It's perfectly fine. All right, I think we're all here. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the panel on the end of American human rights exceptionalism. I would like to thank everyone for being here and for my co-chair, Anil Kalhan, who's from the Drexel School of Law, for assisting with getting this panel together. We are delighted to have a fantastic group of people for this particular topic. Philip Alston, Agnes Calamard, and Mike Breen. We will go for exactly 1 hour, and with that in mind, I'm going to try and keep introductions short. The panelists will each make introductory remarks, probably for about 10 minutes each. We'll have some time for Anil and myself to maybe facilitate conversation amongst the panelists, let them respond to one another, and then we'll open it up for questions. We have the Q&A function, the chat function for questions, and you can use that at any time to make comments or pose questions. And we hope to get to as many of your questions as possible before the end of the hour. So briefly to introduce the panelists today, we have Philip Alston, who's a leading scholar of and advocate for the protection of international human rights. He's the John Norton Pomeroy Professor of Law at NYU and completed his most recent of several stints as a Special Rapporteur under the Special Procedures of the UN Human Rights Council, a Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty. And under that mandate, as well as under several of his earlier mandates, he's examined human rights practices in the United States as well as around the globe. Agnes Calamard is currently serving as a Special Rapporteur for extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions. And under that mandate, she has issued several important reports, including a report on the killing of US-based Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the US killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, and also one recent report on the importance of consular protections to limit the application of the death penalty in the United States and elsewhere. She's had a long career in human rights advocacy, including at Amnesty International. She serves as the head of the Project on Global Freedom of Expression at Columbia, and as well as a special advisor to the president of Columbia University. Mike Breen is here as the executive director of Human Rights First, which is a human rights NGO in the United States. And the history of that NGO is deeply connected to the idea that the United States should be a quote unquote beacon of human rights and incorporate a robust commitment to human rights in its foreign policy. Human Rights First recently issued a report that's called Walking the Talk, a 2021 blueprint for human rights-centered US foreign policy, which, quote, provides specific, achievable, meaningful recommendations for how the US government can rebuild a foreign policy centered on promoting human rights, contesting authoritarianism, leading by example at home, and protecting the most vulnerable, and stemming corruption. Earlier in his career, Mike served in the Office of the White House Counsel in the Obama administration, and also served as a US Army officer with deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he founded the Refugee Assistance Project. So thank you all 3 of you, for sharing your time with us today, especially on a Saturday, and across the various time zones that we all find ourselves, and for all of the participants who are with us here across many, many other time zones for joining us this morning. As the panel description notes, we will be addressing current shifts in domestic and international movements for human rights, exploring the historic origins of and rationales for what is referred to as US human rights exceptionalism. Some people call it exemptionalism, described as the practice through which the United States remains formally outside of all international human rights treaties as a matter of domestic human rights assessment and adjudication. And it also does not subject itself to international human rights adjudication. But at the same time, the United States carries out a foreign policy of human rights through which it asserts its own rights to define and interpret human rights, scrutinize and punish states for their human rights practices. So I have a few framing questions that the panelists have had in advance. So I'll just share those with the participants this morning. To what degree has the Trump administration marked an endpoint to any claims of good US American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States can remain outside of human rights, international human rights system because it has its own exceptional constitutional framework for addressing and meeting human rights obligations. What are the prospects for effective linkages for domestic human rights groups in the United States, including on issues of economic inequality, poverty, Black Lives Matter, and so on, to the UN special procedures or to other processes at regional human rights bodies or through the universal periodic reporting process? How have the human rights problems at home affected the ability of the United States to carry out human rights diplomacy and a human rights foreign policy abroad? And what are, if any, are the prospects for US re-engagement with international human rights in a post-Trump administration framework? How will other states, NGOs, international institutions respond to such efforts of the United States to engage? Okay, with those questions as our framework, Anil, did you have anything you wanted to add to that at this point?
Nope, that covers the ground.
Great, that's wonderful. Okay, so Philip, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Peggy. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to talk with this distinguished group this morning. The starting point is, of course, to reflect on what we mean by US exceptionalism. I think one of the problems of discussions here is that we have tended to focus on the wrong issues to a significant extent. Michael Ignatieff got a very distinguished group of commentators together 15 years ago to write a book on this subject. They identified these three issues. One, signing treaties but not effectively being bound by them or assuming that they will be called to account. Secondly, double standards, insisting that the US be treated differently in some way. And thirdly, the refusal of US courts to engage with foreign or international law. And that list then leads the contributors and the rest of us to look at things like the First Amendment, how the US is different on hate speech and various other issues. We look at capital punishment, how the US is an outlier, at least in the West, and we look at social rights and maybe federalism. I want to suggest that, in fact, the US is not actually so different in relation to most of those issues. Gronje de Burke wrote a very compelling analysis a number of years ago about the extent to which the member countries of the European Union are highly resistant to implementing international human rights treaties within their own jurisprudence, the tentativeness of EU courts to take these standards directly. And I could certainly speak at great length about my country of origin, Australia, which mirrors the United States in a great many ways. So I don't think the US is particularly exceptional when it comes to those issues. So what we need to do is to try to identify how it really is exceptional, because only when we understand that can we think about what the future might hold, what the solutions might be. I think I've identified 5 issues. I'm sure these will be controversial. First of all, there is an assumption of moral superiority on the part of the United States. And I'm not saying that as a cheap criticism. The origins of human rights are seen to lie in the US Bill of Rights. The US is characterized as having a special position, a special responsibility, and so on. That, of course, is a very difficult notion to reconcile with the fundamentals of an international human rights regime. Second, there is actually a pretty deep rejection of the notion of multilateral accountability. which contrasts with US assertions that other states should be constantly accountable, albeit primarily to the US in terms of their conduct and their acceptance of certain values. Thirdly, the role played by government goes to the very core, of course, if we contrast, say, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen with the US Bill of Rights. The French Declaration essentially rejected the role of the aristocracy and the clergy and embraced the need for a strong state that defended the people. The United States rejected the state at the same time as they were rejecting George III. And ever since, and we've seen it in COVID-19, different manifestations, first of all, the absence of healthcare because the state doesn't have any responsibility in that area, it's up to the private sector. Secondly, the refusal of the federal government to coordinate private sector contributions because the government shouldn't interfere in that way. And so we have a sort of dominant assumption of outsourcing to the private sector. I saw a very good article yesterday by Molly Land on outsourcing and privatization in relation to internet governance, which of course is a very important dimension. Fourthly, the role of the courts in the United States, which is only going to become even more dramatically problematic. If you have a notion of originalism, taking us back to the late 18th century, there is no capacity to react to the sort of developments that international human rights law are all about. And fifthly, the influence of race is distinctive. Now, this is a controversial claim in a way, because basically every state is infused with racism. The difference in relation to the US is that its engagement with the international human rights regime has from the very outset been looked at fundamentally through the prism of race. So the approach that Eleanor Roosevelt took in drafting the Universal Declaration, described in detail by Carol Anderson and others, the Bricker Amendment, which was precisely designed to protect the Jim Crow laws in the States, and that general set of assumptions, albeit not articulated these days very often, has remained pretty influential in terms of US human rights policies. I think let me turn to, I've got two other issues I want to address, but I think the definitional one is crucial in a sense. Unless we understand the nature of US exceptionalism, we're going to end up having a fairly hollow discussion. The second issue is the relevance of Black Lives Matter, picking up on the racism point. And then I'd like to conclude with a couple of comments about the way forward. Again, with Black Lives Matter, I think it's important to remember how often we've been here before. The famous NAACP petition of 1947, which was subtitled "A Statement on the Denial of Human Rights to Minorities in the Case of Citizens of Negro Descent in the United States of America and an Appeal to the United Nations for Redress." This sent the UN into a complete tizzy back in 1947. Eleanor Roosevelt adopted all sorts of defensive postures. And the US began its resolve not to engage too much with the international regime. By the early 1960s, Malcolm X was back at the same place. He started traveling extensively, comparing racism in the US to racism elsewhere. And in a speech in 1965, he said, we really need to take our case to the United Nations, and the UN needs to take up racism in America. This shouldn't be seen any longer as a national issue. So I think there are very important lessons to be learned from that, and I'm not sure that they are being learned yet. Looking ahead then, the first thing I think, well, I have to acknowledge that there's a big paradox here, because whatever I might say that's negative about the United States, it's also true that most of the major positive developments, strangely, in the UN context that have occurred have been at the behest of the US. That's the bizarre paradox in all of this. And so that means that looking forward, it is possible that the US could again play a highly constructive role. The first thing I would caution is not to rely on the US government. It is not going to be the driver of a significantly new approach. It will be hugely relieved if there is a new administration to be able to revert back to previous policies. That's a real risk, because the challenges that are out there have changed dramatically, whether it's big tech, whether it's privatization, whether it's racism, whether it's climate change. There's a need for a really new set of approaches, and the US government is generally not good at really innovating in that way. So the onus, I think, is on us. The onus is on civil society groups, and that certainly applies in relation to Black Lives Matter, that it's not through the US government responding in the UN context, or even through other states calling the US out. It's going to be through a recognition by domestic groups that they need to start identifying with these broader movements internationally, that the US is not an island, and that it really needs to work in unison with others to develop a meaningful international human rights regime. I'll leave it at that. My 10 minutes are up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip. I'll turn it over to Agnes.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be speaking for this event. So I will address more or less the same issues as Philip did, and some of the points I'm making will be actually similar to his. So I'll go quickly. The first point I want to say that a global power, a global actor with global footprints that think it should only answer domestically is an unjust power. And in a world where the United States is attempting to impose its hegemony in the new international system, I think that's a very weak basis to operate from. And I will hope that if there is a new administration, that they will realize that their ambition to be at least the hegemonic, to be the hegemonic power, or to be the superpower alongside China, that being committed and able to think globally, including around accountability, that will be a major source of legitimacy. And they don't have that at the moment. So about the American exceptionalism, what can we say? I think Philip has already laid out many sources of that exceptionalism. I am going to add, or maybe I highlight some of the consequences of that. First of all, I think what they are, American exceptionalism is highlighting the fact that the limits and limitations of domestic focus when it comes to remedies and reparation. There is, it is quite extraordinary that no administration has acceded to the Convention on the Right of the Child, the Rome Statute, the optional protocol on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discriminations Against Women, the Convention Against Torture, and so on. So the fact that there is no mechanisms to move those issues forward, I think is highlighting the limitation of domestic remedies in the 21st century, demonstrating also that domestic remedies without an international grounding are never sufficient. And the parochialism of the US court system has already been highlighted by Philip around the originalism or the textualism as a legal philosophy. It's always so mind-boggling to me that that particular philosophy, but the implication of it for the people of the United States and the inability or unwillingness of judges to consider judicial experience outside the United States, that is really undermining judicial wisdom, as I have found in the work I do on freedom of expression in particular. It means that its legal judgment are certainly behind the curve, and nothing is clearer on that than with the new issues, and Philip has mentioned internet and the online digital questions, I think, are extraordinarily poorly as addressed by court in the United States, and that's largely because of this this exceptionalism and this obsession with some of its sacred text, not the First Amendment in that case, but the third issue, the third implication of this exceptionalism is that the absence of commitment to international-based scrutiny, even though I fully agree, is not actually exceptional to the US, but it's a tragedy for the world because we are talking about a global power with a global footprint, and therefore the implication of this rejection of international scrutiny are far more serious, I will say, than when Belgium, for instance, or Hungary does the same. And that we can see around a range of questions. Some of them are related to war crimes, the accountability of US corporate actions abroad, US supply chains. I mean, there are some form of regulatory system inside the US that are not actually that are actually trying to address the weaknesses, but it is not sufficient. And the fact of the rejection that those actions abroad or domestically could be scrutinized by international bodies is having implications far beyond the United States and is impacting on the rights of people globally. So the US credibility, I've already suggested, has been gravely damaged over the last 4 years, but we will be wrong to treat that exceptionalism as a product of a Republican president. Most of the issue that we assigned to this exceptionalism are structural issues or systemic issues, and administration after administrations have done nothing to address them. I mean, yes, Obama tried to ratify the International Criminal Court an hour before he left the White House or something, but you know. So we need to be careful not to suggest that Donald Trump has created this exceptionalism. It may certainly have made it worse, but it is not. It is certainly not a Republican phenomena. So we need to move away from the swing back and forth, or suggest that swinging back to a Democrat leader will change that. We need to reject a false binary here between a great global thinking Democrat and a very bad parochial Republican. I think that's not the way it is. Even though there may be on some level some element of truth, one of them could be, for instance, around women's rights and the global gag rule, which is the complete Republican initiative. But otherwise, it is not a Republican issue. And we need to take and integrate the systemic problems that I have highlighted and Philippe has highlighted when we consider how to fight that back. So very quickly, maybe for the next step. One contradiction maybe that I have to make with my own words is that if there was a new administration coming into power, there will be significant differences at the level of human rights diplomacy. There will be a dynamism and a space that will be far more consistent and strong if the United States was back into the Human Rights Court, in this case, the Human Rights Council and other institutions. The European Union is extraordinarily weak in terms of asserting a strong perspective, particularly on civil and political rights. And we are in an international system where China is extremely astute and powerful in pushing its own legitimate role within the human rights circle. And at this point, I will say the only one that can oppose it in a meaningful way is the United States. And the only one that can balance a Chinese perspective on human rights is the United States. And we can elaborate on that. So this is, I think, to me, that will the US back will make a difference in the same way than when Obama got elected after Bush. There was a tremendously new vibrancy within the Human Rights Council over a number of issues. And I will hope that maybe we will have a similar experience. But that's, that's a bit superficial in terms of addressing exceptionalism. But nevertheless, for us for some of us on the front line, it will matter. The other issues, I think, for the US, if there is an awareness after those 4 years that is more present now than it was before, if the new administration is prepared to take all the lessons of what this exceptionalism pushed to its extreme has meant for the US and for the world, then they need to take real action. And I will hope, for instance, that they will consider implementing or putting in place an independent human rights commission, a human rights institution of some kind, like other countries have done, which would monitor and evaluate situation. I will hope that a number of states will also adopt or implement or create a human rights institution. I will hope that this new administration will ratify treaties that for the last 20 something years have not been ratified. That will make, it will not make a huge difference, but it will send a message. You know, there are a few treaties that need to be ratified by the United States. So that's something that will, you know, will be very welcomed. And more generally, I will say at the cultural level, to address the moral superiority as some mindset, which I don't disagree with, by the way. You know, I think the academia has a big role to play here, particularly law school. In the way law is being taught, in the way that comparative jurisprudence, comparative law, how it's being taught, to me is extremely problematic. The fact that there is such a little global perspective ingrained in students when they leave law school, that's very problematic. They will learn that eventually, you know, whether they do corporate law or some, but you know, I think the academe must train the legal thinkers who will adopt a global mindset. And only then can we start seeing judges, I think, being a little bit more open, because there is no reason why they can't consider at least what a court has, you know, how they look at certain issues, and possibly the digital era and the fact that other courts around the world have taken such a step forward on thinking through the protection of rights in the digital era, that may force US court judges, lawyers to, you know, to look at the rest of the world. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Agnes. Mike, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to be on this panel, especially Philip and Agnes. And I find myself agreeing with a great deal of what they've said. And so I think rather than rehash what they've said and say it again in different words, what I think I'll do is try to offer the perspective of someone who's trying to do human rights work inside the United States, linked to the American identity. You know, as you mentioned, Human Rights First has, among many other advocacy organizations in the United States, spent about 40 years asking America essentially to live up to the better angels of its nature. And there's an element of appeal to exceptionalism, the quote unquote good kind that's part of that. It's not entirely dissimilar from Dr. King's call to the United States to do what you said you would do on paper, calling back to the original documents and founding documents of the country. So, you know, as Philip and Agnes have said quite eloquently and extensively, there's nothing new about the sense of American human rights exceptionalism. It dates back to the late 40s in the origin of the modern system. I think we do find ourselves at a very dangerous moment, though, where that exceptionalism has become much more dangerous than it has been in the past. And maybe I'll talk about kind of what I think are three broad reasons why, and then talk a little bit about where we might go from here. The first is, I think, and this is not a Republican or Democratic issue, but there has been a sea change in American politics in which we have lost the virtue of hypocrisy on human rights. And by that, I mean, you know, we're all frustrated with hypocrisy, but it leaves the possibility of shame. And what we've got now is an American politics in which a large number of leaders, including, unfortunately, the president, no longer seek to justify American foreign policy through the lens of human rights, but instead entirely reject the idea that human rights applies both inside the United States and abroad. So, you know, you would make arguments to the Bush administration or the Obama administration, and they would respond with a sense that the United States was doing what was right and necessary in the world. You make those arguments to this administration, and they call you naive for believing in these ideas at all. That's a sea change, and that's not a sea change around one leader. It's a sea change in the American electorate. The quiet part is now being said out loud. And that's true of our domestic human rights issues, which are now quite acute. Once again, and as Philip quite rightly pointed out, there's nothing new about that. but they're front and center yet again, as they should be. And that's also true internationally. So it's one thing to have a very powerful country claiming human rights exceptionalism on the basis of virtue. And it's another thing to have a very powerful country claiming human rights exceptionalism purely on the basis of power. And I fear that we're headed in that direction, and that's extraordinarily dangerous. For those of us on the front lines of human rights, it also means we've had to accept, as you mentioned, Peggy, that we do have a book-length set of recommendations that we believe in for what the next administration might do to right the ship somewhat on human rights. These are all discretionary decisions that an administration might make if they wish to pursue good policy. I'm hopeful that they'll be pursued. They're all reversible, of course, right? And so we're operating in a world in which we have to accept that the American electorate is willing to elect someone, many people, in fact, elect leaders who are, in a sense, run against human rights, who hit the campaign trail saying things like war crimes are fine, we should torture people, we should ban religions from entry to the country, and so on. So that's a dangerous sea change inside the United States. And I think we're all aware that within American domestic politics, there's this tremendous debate happening about trying to shore up the fundamental institutions and norms of the democracy itself. We're at a dangerous moment for our own internal politics. Meanwhile, we're at a similar moment globally. And I just mentioned China, that's real. We are moving from a Cold War and then unipolarity frame into something different. I think it's too simplistic to say we're returning to multilateralism or some kind of Cold War with China, but the international system is changing. The relative power of the United States is changing. And that creates a tremendous amount of instability. Facing that moment at the exact time that the United States is going through this question as to whether human rights exceptionalism or human rights adherence is in its enlightened self-interest is a dangerous moment. And then third, there are just a number of issues that the human rights community in the United States and around the world is confronting in which time is not on our side. And these other two dynamics are robbing us of time we need. We could talk about climate change. We could definitely talk about technology and the relationship between technology and authoritarianism, the emerging models of social control and other things that China's pioneering and exporting and demonstrating to the world. There are a number of new and very dangerous challenges to the idea of human rights, period, that we're having a great deal of trouble grappling with because of these other two dynamics I've mentioned. I'll probably leave it there, except to say that I agree very strongly with Philip. I want to just absolutely endorse his last point. This is a civil society challenge. I think we should have absolutely no illusions that the United States government, an imperfect champion and now perhaps an intermittent champion, if we think about the electorals, the political cycles inside the United States, is going to right the system. I think this is a matter of civil society. And here I see some cause for pretty considerable hope in the ways in which movements around the world, including in the United States, are sort of searching for and gradually finding and experimenting with a new sense, a new vocabulary for universal human rights, a new sense of the universal that's far beyond, with all respect to our heritage as a movement, it's beyond 1948, it's beyond Eleanor Roosevelt. They're finding new vocabulary. They're finding, and that extends into legal arguments. And I think that is beautiful and powerful. And I'm also very, very hopeful that a new generation of Americans who are involved in this work are embracing that with their international colleagues. And there's a lot to work through, but there are also a lot of really good conversations happening and a lot of experimentation that's happening. And that's where I find hope. I think there's a tremendous amount of energy in the movement right now. And I don't see younger American leaders in the human rights movement with exceptionalist instincts. I see, in fact, quite the opposite. I've seen in the last 4 years, especially a tremendous hunger to learn from others who have done human rights work in more challenging environments on the part of younger American human rights leaders. And that's been a beautiful thing to see at a time of adversity. So I'm hopeful for that reason, and I look forward to a conversation.
Great. I'm like to invite Philip and Agnes, if you have any responses, particularly since I think Mike's bringing this back to sort of convergence between the domestic and the international, circles back and underscores some of your earlier points. And then I'd like to invite Anil as well to see if he has any comments or questions amongst the panel, and then we can turn it over to the questions. So Philip, Agnes.
Thanks, Peggy. I hadn't expected this opportunity, but I will now speak for half an hour to criticize what Mike said. I think, I mean, the panel is remarkably unanimous in a problematic way, I suppose. It'll be interesting to hear from some of the audience who might want to push back and see things quite differently. I guess the only interesting thing I can think to say is that having looked at the terrific report that Mike put together for a new administration, I wonder how to reconcile what is actually a very traditional approach, you know, looking at the use of the Magnitsky Act, looking at the ways in which the endless war on terror can be curtailed, US practices on Guantanamo, on humanitarian law, etc., more generally, can be better respected. How that sits with the much broader agenda that Mike actually embraced, you know, ranging through technology, climate change, and various other issues.
Would it be a good idea for me to just quickly, so that the document is explicitly limited in scope. You know, we thought to ourselves, what can you do very fast? And what are accessible, concrete policy levers you can pull right away to sort of start to right the ship a little bit? And so this is really the first year of an administration that is going to be facing a tremendous challenge, especially in context. A deeply divided country, a country that is having a very hard time grappling with the pandemic, a country that just has to get itself to some extent stabilized. These are the human rights achievements that are possible in the first 6 months to a year of that context. It's not intended to be a sweeping visionary document, but I absolutely I want to be absolutely unequivocal. I embrace the broader vision. I think it's essential. I think, in fact, it's existential for the human rights movement. We must think boldly about these massive changes, or, to be blunt, and this may be a controversial thing to say, I spend a lot of time worrying about a future that threatens the idea of rights at all. That's the future that I think we are fighting against. And so these policy changes, they matter. What the United States does on all of these issues matters. But we have very little time, I think, to deal with some very, very serious challenges to human rights.
So I think we have a few questions. Anil, do you want to moderate the questions in the chat box?
Sure. So I'll just throw my own question to the panelists as well, but before turning to these other questions. I'd be interested in pushing a little bit on the paradox, Philip, that you've identified, and the related one, Agnes, that you have, in terms of, on the one hand, the U.S. role. The U.S. government will not save us, but in fact, actually, that positive developments often do come from U.S. actors. And Agnes, your rejection of the false binary between the parties, and yet at the same time there being space for a difference between them, and as a way of just thinking about how to get out of those paradoxes. But I'll just put that on the table because we're limited on time, and turn to some of the questions from the audience. We have a question about the Pompeo Commission, and might it be possible to think about, how to evaluate the merits of the Unalienable Rights Commission, notwithstanding its origins, and how civil society has engaged it, I think, is the thrust of the question. And, in particular, the contributions of Ken Roth, Thor Halvorsen, and R.A. Nair, and so on.
I'm just gonna make 2 points about it. The first is that we have, in my assessment, we have an administration at the moment, a Trump administration, that is thoroughly trying to reset the rule of the game, domestically and internationally. It is an administration that is not only a Republican administration in the sense of the way the others have been. It is an administration that is absolutely committed to let go of the last 70 years in terms of institutions, in terms of legal framework. So it is not just that it's rejecting, it is that it's trying to rebuild something else. It's trying to recreate a cement that will that will support its worldview and its search for asserting American hegemony. That's the context for me of that Pompeo Commission. It is an attempt to not only to reject the UDHR and so on, but to say to the world, actually, we are entering a new world, and we need to rethink the cement that glue us together, or part of it, and the rights as they are imagined or thought through by the Pompeo Commission are, in my view, what the purpose of that is to serve that worldview and that hegemonic search for hegemony. So, it's so from the political motivation, I think it's extraordinarily problematic as a single country initiative. And in terms of the content of it, much has been written about the way and the construction of rights that is coming through the Commission, and the very narrow and limited aspect. It's not that, it does not have any merit. That's just the end of the, I do not see how any rights activist or thinker or expert with a minimum understanding of human rights will look at it as carrying any kind of merit, either in terms of process, in terms of worldview, or in terms of content.
Yeah, I'd just like to jump in and add to that. I completely agree with Agnes's last point about it not having merit. And this relates to Mike's point about government versus civil society. What's strange about, it's always struck me as strange about that commission is the structure it took as an advisory body to an executive branch agency that really has the State Department doesn't define what international human rights are. To the extent that there's any defining of what the United States government believes international human rights are, that's been carried out by Congress, either through treaty approval in minimal cases, or through more extensive human rights legislation, the management of human rights foreign policy through a very extensive statutory regime. So it always struck me as misplaced. But it raises the question, I just wanted to sort of circle back on this issue of civil society versus governments. And I think it's the heart of Philip's paradox of US views of state power and states as guarantors of affirmative rights, which is, how does civil society move forward without an engagement of the United States legislative branch? And I'm sort of thinking about the parallel discussions going on about court jurisdiction, which relates to these issues of courts being receptive to international modes of interpretation of rights. In the early 1970s, it was led by Congress, right? The pushes came from Congress. And I wonder if any of you have any thoughts about that, and whether that might be a mechanism through which to open the dam, so to speak, to make connections between civil society, but also between the United States government and foreign states, given the global developments.
Anil, just a very quick comment. I'm often conflicted about things on the Commission on Unalienable Rights. Part of me wants to see this as almost a Borat moment. In other words, these guys are crazy. This is like Kazakhstan getting together and saying, we're going to rewrite the Universal Declaration. Who cares? No legitimacy at all. The other side of it, though, is you've got to admire the ambition. And it's what worries me is the contrast between Glendon and her fellow travelers who think they can simply rewrite the whole thrust of international human rights law in one go, and the people who, if Biden wins, will succeed them in the State Department. The likelihood is that the new State Department will be incredibly timid and will say, can we do a couple of little things around the edges? Can we start talking about social rights? We're not going to endorse them. We're not going to accept that there's a right to health, let alone a right to water, but we'll just sort of engage a little bit. And wouldn't it be lovely if there were people in the State Department who would say, look, now's the time for a bold new reimagination, but one that really reaches out, one that has community consultation in the US, consultation with other countries, but really comes up with a new approach.
I think that's a beautiful thought. That's a beautiful and inspiring thought. I think as many of you are aware, I mean, we've been quite active on the commission. My colleague Rob Brzezinski has done incredible work leading the opposition to it. I think it's very, very difficult to see it as anything but an exercise conducted in bad faith, to put it mildly. And I think it's probably best understood through the lens of American domestic politics. And I think I'll kind of leave it there. But it is not a thing, I think, despite some of its absurdities, that one can ignore. When the State Department starts to engage in a process to begin a conversation about rank ordering rights and tying them to religious texts and all kinds of things like that, I think you have to oppose it. But it would be nice, I agree, to see similar vision for those of us who wish to expand rights to meet the moment. I think that'll come from civil society, and government will respond. That tends to be what always happens in the United States and most other places.
And I guess my question, sort of in response to your responses, remains the one of, taking as a given that civil society is the lead and most important actor. What are the kinds of things that an incoming administration, this is picking up on one of the questions from the audience, what are the kinds of things that are most important for a new administration to shift in a different direction? I mean, Philip, your response sort of also has echoes in a lot of domestic discussions about the asymmetric nature of constitutional hardball between the two political parties. How should a new incoming administration act differently to facilitate a more effective and robust civil society response?
I think this is an interesting, I would just make the obvious point that many people have made looking at the United States right now, which is that a lot of our governing institutions, we've just reached the point, the Senate is the classic example of this. We've just reached the point where what the majority of Americans believe and what is possible through our political institutions is so misaligned that there's a need of reform. And so I think as we talk about what can an incoming administration do to reform that, the United States has frankly just got to get we've got to get a democratic House in order. And that extends to the judicial branch, and that absolutely extends to things like the Electoral College and the Senate map. I'm in the middle of the country right now. It's a beautiful place. It's wonderful. The state that I'm in has 2 senators and constitutes the population of lower Manhattan, not even the whole island, to say nothing of New York City. It's a system that served the United States for some period of time, but we're reaching the breaking point on it. And almost everything we're discussing, including the international issues we're talking about, including the commission, they're all dominated by this internal conflict the United States is going through. And it's really, I think, a debate about pluralism and a global and membership in a global community, or a more parochial view of the country, to put it gently. It's hard to have a conversation about how to rectify other things without it. But to the point about the United States participating in international human rights bodies and the like, and treaties, reserving judgment on whether that's politically possible at the moment, I think it's really, really important that we focus on making that happen in the near future. Specifically because this idea of American exceptionalism and separateness from the system has gone from frustrating to, I think, affirmatively dangerous in a pretty short period of time.
So we have a question from Leila Sadat about enhancing the education of law students in the US to bring a global perspective, and the idea that the students are getting that as undergraduates, and then law school faculties are narrowly US focused. Just picking up on Agnes's point. Thoughts about that? Agnes, maybe start with you and then Philip.
I'm not sure what the question is. I've already, explained that in my view there needed to be a reform of the way law school is being, law is being taught, and I have looked at it in great details from the standpoint of freedom of expression, where I have seen the First Amendment being the only source of legal understanding on freedom of expression that has been instilled, even though we are talking about an issue that and a product and content that is acted out and created and reproduced across borders. And I know for a fact that very few students will actually leave knowing anything about Article 19 of the ICCPR or Article 10 of the European Convention, let alone the jurisprudence of the European Court or even the inter-American system, to which the US should be slightly. So, I don't have much more to say. I think there is a real need for the, for international perspective to be instilled in the way law is being taught. I'm not just talking about international law. Of course, you can do, but that to me is important. And in the rest of the world, it is a little easier because at least in Europe, in Africa, and in Latin America, the legal system are very integrated at a regional level. So there is a tendency to, at the very least, understand the law at the regional level, and because of that, to also understand the international standard. But I think it is very, it's a long-term dynamic that must be reversed so that we have a more global perspective in judicial decisions. I just wanted to maybe comment on the previous points. I think it is, we have had under the Trump administration a real strategy of disruption. So everything has been disrupted. Everything we believed in, everything we thought was fairly well, stable, has been shaken. The perspective on the press as a sacred, protected force. Power, the discussion on race, the notion that there are global human rights, universal human rights. I mean, so much disruption being driven by the Trump administration, and that's why, to me, there is a real worldview here. It's an hegemonic project, not just an attempt to to be in power. We are also globally in an era where there are many forces and dynamics that should push us to be critical. So we need to resist, of course, some of what is happening, but we need to resist without entering into a sacralization. Don't know if that's English, but we need to also take ownership of disruption for our own sake in the same way that BLM did. And that's why they have been that's why we are all, I think, so taken by the Me Too movement and by Black Lives Matter, because they didn't just do what has been done in the past. They have really disrupted the way we had thought about some of those issues. The fact that BLM is asking to defund the police, to me, is an extraordinarily important call that resonates globally. And I do agree forcefully with the point that Philip and Mike has done. The American civil society, I'm not convinced they will think globally themselves, but I think their messages resonate globally. And BLM and Me Too have demonstrated that beyond American exceptionalism, there is the universality of the messages coming from American groups, from American vulnerable groups. This universalism is unbelievable, and it is something that the US should do everything to support and to really project internationally.
We are at time, and I think Agnes's very passionate call for universalism and a universal joining of these movements across the globe is a great place to end. And I would, we did have some questions we couldn't get to, including Mike Breen will have some votes if he runs for office, and some shout outs to Philip Alston's excellent piece about in the Harvard Law Review about the genealogy of the human rights debates going on within the academy. So I apologize for those we couldn't get to all of your questions. This has been a fantastic panel, lots of food for thought. And I think to get back to the question about Layla's question about the academy, it's important that these events happen and that students are exposed to these debates and understandings, and we take them back to those of us who teach to our faculties and try and fight the fights over curriculum at our respective faculties. Some of us are veterans of those discussions about globalization of the curriculum. So we'll do a virtual round of applause. Anil, if you have any final comments or join in the applause.
No, thanks to everyone. This has been a great panel.
Thanks, everyone.